Thank you all for being here today. Yesterday was supposed to be a now normal day in Atlanta. I spent most of my afternoon offering testimony to a congressional committee that was led by Chairman Jim Clyburn. And at the end of the testimony from mayors across this country, he read a poem by Langston Hughes. And he said this poem often rested in his heart while he was a student protesting during the civil rights movement. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? What we saw in Atlanta last night and what we are seeing in cities across America is an explosion. And what should not be lost in this explosion is what this anger and frustration is about for so many across America. Our communities are sick, and they are tired, and they are now dying. I often think of what the day's news and events mean to my children and try and imagine what it is to see it through their lens. But I had a conversation with my mother this week that was a very sobering conversation. My mother, who grew up in Atlanta in the segregated South, said to me a couple of days ago, this doesn't feel like we've gone back to 1965 in America. This feels like something before 1965 in America. This is what it feels like. It feels this way for men and boys, black women and girls. It feels this way for grandmothers and grandfathers in America. And there are many people standing with me today. Many are part of our public safety team here. When they take off these uniforms, they are black men and women in America. So I don't want you for 1 minute to think we don't get it and we don't understand and we don't hurt. Because this is us. I said last night, and I will say it again, what we saw last night was not a protest, it was chaos. What got my mother past 1965 in America was an organized movement that recognized there were systematic issues in this country that needed to be changed. There was no organization to what we saw last night. Many of the protesters who began as peaceful protesters, and I thank all of you all who did that last night, many of whom I doubt voted for me last time and I doubt will vote for me the next time, came here last night and said that was not us. We may not always agree, but we didn't do that to our city last night. So that we can figure out and sort out who cares about peaceful change in this city and who is here to destroy our city, I am taking the very unusual and extreme step of instituting a curfew in our city this evening from 9 p.m. to sunrise. This is not to infringe upon anyone's rights. You all have rights, and we respect each of your rights. But we cannot let happen what happened in our city last night and what we are witnessing happening across America this evening. So I ask you to please, if at all possible, find yourselves in a safe place in your home this evening. Please know where your children are this evening. We do not want to have to arrest your children. We don't want to have to detain anyone. But we will maintain order in the streets of Atlanta this evening. That being said, I want to thank the men and women who have come in from jurisdictions across this state to assist us in this effort, also our leadership team, and also to Governor Brian Kemp and the resources we have been provided by the state to help us maintain order. We recognize that there are still so many issues and challenges that need to be addressed, and they will not be resolved today. But again, it cannot be lost on why people are angry and what we've witnessed time and time again in this country. So I want to recognize those feelings and let you know we understand those feelings, but there will have to be a peaceful way in which we can resolve and discuss and continue to work through and push through the systematic issues that plague us as a country. So with that, I am going to are you speaking? Okay. I'm going to turn it over to our public safety personnel to speak and give more information on where we are this evening, and then we will open up for questions. And also thank you to Councilmember Joyce Shepard, Bishop Murphy, Reverend Thomas, Reverend Rice, and all of the others who are standing with us today.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Erica Shields. I'm Chief of Police for the Atlanta Police Department. Yesterday, we knew that we anticipated that we would have a protest of some sort in light of the goings-on in Minneapolis. And just to be clear, no one in law enforcement who is of sound mind supports the behavior. That was a murder. It was a murder that was filmed and in broad daylight, and it didn't matter to the cop. And what I'd say to you, it didn't just not matter to the cop, it didn't matter to that human being. And that goes to the greater issue at hand that my mayor is alluding to. Our posture in Atlanta is one of tolerance. It's the birthplace of civil rights. We have a very strong, affluent, and well-respected African-American community, and we take pride and view it as our responsibility to hear them. After the murder in Minneapolis, we knew there was going to be much anger, fear, raw emotion. Our posture with protests is one of tolerance. We accommodate the folks. We know we're going to get yelled at. We know we're going to get spit on. We know there's going to be a lot of anger to us. But that goes with our job, and it's okay. And we will accommodate those protests for days on end so people can be heard. They have a right to be heard. That was our posture as we went into last night's event. And initially, things were fairly routine. It became apparent a couple, 2-3 hours in, that there were people within the protest who were not here to protest. They were here to destroy Atlanta. The behavior was not to make a position statement. It was one of just violence, extreme violence. The problem is, by the time we recognized that we had this sector, they were embedded in with all of these other hundreds of individuals. So how do you extract a couple hundred people out of 1,000 without injuring the other 800? When people are throwing knives, have Molotov cocktails, throwing rocks, gunshots are going off. At that point, we had to back off from the posture of making arrests and shutting down the protest. We had to go to a position of holding the line and getting enough resources in that we could recover safely. It became apparent to me pretty quickly that my officers were in extreme harm. And we knew we were sitting on a powder keg. And our goal was to just stay on that lid until we could get some help. One of the best things about the state of Georgia is that we have an incredible law enforcement community. They all step up, federal, state, local, and help us out. I didn't even have to ask people to send police. They showed up. But it took a long time to get the necessary equipment, the necessary personnel to do this safely. It had gotten that violent. When we knew that we could start dispersing the crowd safely to the people who had come to protest and were still lingering to watch, safely to the officers, then it became a forward-moving process. We started to gain successes in the COP area, by which time the group had splintered off, a large number of them, and gone up to the north end of our city, Buckhead. By now, it had become very apparent to us that this was a highly calculated terrorist organization. And I don't say that loosely. When you come in and your goal is to inflict harm, damage, property damage, without any regard to human life, you are a terrorist. Thankfully, we were in alignment, in agreement, and we had the support of Governor Kemp, who brought in the National Guard. We needed them. The level of violence had reached that point. These were not Atlantans. We knew they were not Atlantans. They were lost when they were in the protest. They didn't know how to march to the state capitol. That's a clue. And their behaviors was so unfamiliar territory for us. The protesters who organized protests in Atlanta, we know them. They don't always agree with us. Sometimes they'll be the first ones to go out publicly against us. They didn't know these people. They didn't want these people. Because at this point, they were not fighting for anyone's civil rights. They were here to destroy Atlanta. With the help of all of our partners, and we were able to close out the evening safely. I really was afraid I was going to have an officer shot and killed. As we come back into today, we have an absolute zero tolerance policy, zero. There will be no lawlessness. It's not about protesting anymore. It's about saving our city. This is not who Atlanta is. And these folks who have come here thinking they're going to pull this crap are mistaken. Yes, you caught us off balance once. It's not going to happen twice. The curfew is useful for us for the simple reason we have a lot of folks who are out just lingering and mingling, and it creates high numbers of individuals, and it makes it difficult for us to distinguish who's just wanting to film the events of the evening, who's just wanting to protest, and who wants to throw knives and shoot guns at innocent people. The curfew allows us to say, please, just go in, let us deal with the people who came here with ill intent. And so I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for the curfew for that reason, that it allows us to focus on the problem. But this will not be tolerated. And anyone that thinks that this is something that the mayor and I subscribe to is clueless. Clueless. But we had to handle last night in the manner that provided the safest route out for our employees. And that was not going head to head with these folks who are just so violent. So I feel that we're in a good space, and quite frankly, I'm ready to just lock people up. And there you go. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Rodney Bryant, the Interim Director of Corrections. My duties for these events is to do public safety coordination throughout this event. We are utilizing the National Guard, Georgia State Patrol, and our Metro law enforcement partners. The strategies and the tactics that we'll use is, as Chief Shields stated, is that we will have no tolerance for any illegal actions or events throughout tonight. Once the officers give people commands and directions on what they need to do, we want them to carry them out and do so quickly and safely. But immediately after that, when we find that we are having resistance, we will go ahead and start making arrests. That's throughout the city. We have an understanding that there is a level of proper and legal protest, but once it gets outside those parameters, our duties as law enforcement officers is to go ahead and effect those arrests to make sure that the people of Atlanta remain safe and comfortable inside this city. And so we will carry out our duties as quickly as possible tonight. As the chief and the mayor have stated, we cannot tolerate the level of activities that we had last night. And so we will not. We encourage people to adhere to the curfew that the mayor has stated at 9 o'clock to clear the streets. Because after that, we recognize that if you're out in these streets beyond that time, it's for ill intent. And we will have to address you in such a manner. So please, we're encouraging you to make sure that you clear the streets after 9 o'clock. If you're out in the streets currently, adhere to the orders of the police officers so that they can make sure that you remain safe throughout today. As the chief stated, the partners that we are bringing in are to assist us. The National Guard is here to protect the assets of the city, and law enforcement is here to do exactly what they are prescribed to do, and that is to protect keep the peace of this city. And that's where we will remain throughout tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Randall Slaughter, Fire Chief. Let me start by saying I am extremely proud of the work of the men and women of the Atlanta Fire and Rescue Department on last night. We had a very long night, and we anticipate we'll have another long night tonight. I want to also thank all of the fire chiefs who were gracious enough to send resources in. I requested resources through the Georgia Mutual Aid Group, and we actually received units from 6 different municipalities, so I'm very grateful for that. I have been in conversations with fire chiefs across the country, and some of them expressed that they had over 30 fires on last night. We had 8, 2 structure fires related to the protests. So it was bad, but it was not as bad as it could get tonight. We're planning and preparing for the worst. I think we're ready. We're at full staffing, and so we're ready, and we're going to have a good night tonight. My primary concern as fire chief is the safety of our responders. Last night, some of our fire units came under attack. We had 8 vehicles damaged, and so tonight we formulated a plan where the units will be escorted into fires with law enforcement support. So we're ready, and we're also going to support the incident command system. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is William Murphy. I'm the bishop and the lead pastor of the Dream Center Church of Atlanta. Today, I wanted to just stand and provide our support from the faith community to our mayor, to our chief of police, and to this Atlanta community at large. Tomorrow is an incredibly important day for the church as we celebrate what's called Pentecost Sunday. Peter, as he was addressing the church after the release of the Spirit, said to them, repent. What that means is you need to change your mind. And so we stand today with our mayor, with our chief, with this city to say to those of you who have come to this city, you need to change your mind. That there's a different direction that we need to take this in. Peter went on to say that this promise of the Spirit is for you and your children. So I echo the words of our mayor tonight. Know where your children are. Be responsible for your house. Set your house in order because there's a promise coming to your house, and we want to restore faith and hope to the city of Atlanta. This is an incredible place, an incredible place. I moved here 20 years ago, an incredible place to raise our children, to raise our families. And in the words of one of our artists here, he says, "Welcome to Atlanta, where the players play." I want to say, welcome to Atlanta, where the prayers pray. Madam Mayor, we're praying for you. Chief, we're praying for you. We're praying for our city. And in the words of William Murphy, hold your head up. Things are going to get better.
Thank you. And with that, we'll open up for any questions that you have.
Mayor, can you talk a little bit about some of the rumors going around about looting happening at Lennox, other parts of Buckhead, and Camp Creek is currently right now trending on Twitter, and people are getting prepared for what they are expecting to be looting tonight. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll let one of our leaders step in on this. We're seeing the same things that you're seeing on social media, and so we are monitoring social media and being prepared with our resources and our people in place accordingly. And I want to go back to something Chief Shields said. Chief Shields mentioned being very fortunate that we didn't lose any public safety personnel last night. I'm also grateful we didn't lose any protesters last night. Last night was as volatile as it gets. And even in our briefing earlier today, Chief Slaughter shared that we found Molotov cocktails that had not exploded in many businesses today. So for as bad as this looked on television, this was 10 times worse last night. And we hadn't even uttered the name of Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd let me go down the list. Breonna Taylor, we could go down the list. We've not even uttered those names today. Not to mention COVID-19. If you were out protesting last night, you probably need to go get a COVID test this week. Because there's still a pandemic in America that's killing black and brown people at higher numbers. Right.
So the chief called it a calculated terrorist group. Do you know the name of this group? Or these outsiders? Or?
These are anarchists, many of them were. And this is what we're seeing across America. I can give you my personal political thoughts on this. I think this is political interference in many ways. I think this is disruption. We've seen this before. We saw it in 2016, that there were attempts to disrupt racial issues in America. Now, we lit the match in America, so we've certainly opened the door with where we are today, with what's happened over the past few weeks. But I think there are many who are taking advantage of the opportunity that's been given to them.
Chief Shields, are you worried that your men and women would be outnumbered? Is that one of the reasons why you're taking all these extra steps and the curfew?
No. I think that the curfew is useful in this for the reasons I stated, and that is it allows us to better zero in on those individuals who are out to commit criminal activity. And, you know, the protests were fine. I mean, we're used to it. I don't mind working it. And you actually learn a lot if you listen to the people protesting. It's a good connection tool. The problem is when you can't, on the surface, distinguish who is there to protest and who is out there for to commit violence. And so this really just helps us better zero in on those individuals who are here to wreak havoc. And those are the individuals that I want to put my hands on. I don't want to, I have no desire, or the department has no desire to just lock up people. But I'm telling you, these folks are not Atlantans, and they have come here with a very deliberate purpose, and that is to tear this city apart in different ways. And it just makes it easier for us to see who is out there if we don't have other people milling with them, if you don't have people driving around in cars, filming things. So it's just, it makes it visually more manageable.
Chief Shields, can we ask you about, do you know of any specific group names that you guys are looking for? Or if somebody's out there maybe trying to protest today, we're getting reports of these protests, what should they be looking for to say maybe this is not somebody I want to be walking with?
No, I think the mayor nailed it. It's anarchist. You don't need a formal name for it. They have an end game that they're focused on, but now the label of who they are and who they're associated with, it's the behaviors that are consistent and you can track across various cities. And what I'll say is most of our protesters, at some form or level, they know each other, are familiar with one another, and even if they come as outsiders, there's a similarity. This is different. This is markedly different.
Can you talk to us about the specific intelligence that your folks are looking into that you believe that some sort of threat is imminent?
I don't think that a threat is imminent. I think that the behaviors exhibited by those individuals last night are indicative of the lengths they will go to wreak havoc. And we have an obligation to step forward, match them in their game, and beat them.
Chief, do you mind talking a little bit more about the curfew? Can you just give some specifics of it?
Sure.
Because for people who are like, does this mean I can't go out for a walk tonight and I'll get picked up? What is it exactly?
So let me say to you, we have no desire just to mess with people and say, hey, there's a curfew, you need to be inside. I think that we have, I'll let the law department speak to the particulars of it. For us, I think it's very straightforward. Where we are seeing issues, it helps us determine who is engaged in nefarious behavior. But are we looking to go on a side street and pick up somebody because they're walking to the store to get a bag of chips? No, that's not who we are. It's not who, I don't want to be a part of any police department that polices that way. But I think the issue is such that we'll know it when we see it.
And let me be clear on the curfew, with the example the chief gave. If there's somebody who's walking to the store, they'll get a warning. Hey, there's a 9 o'clock curfew in case you hadn't heard. Please go home. This is about some other stuff that we have going on in the city. What's your question?
The curfew in Minneapolis, they had one on Thursday night, and it didn't work. What's to say this is going to work tonight?
We'll know tonight. I mean, we're announcing it 3 hours before, so we don't know if it's going to work or not. But I don't know where my 4 children are at 9 o'clock tonight, and that's what my hope is. There were a lot of well-intentioned people out last night. There were people who came to be a part of a movement. They came out to be heard and organize in the protests in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in this country and in this city. And even with all of the organized protests of the civil rights movement, they were just that. They were organized protests. There were some days they were planning to go out, and then they stood back because it wasn't the appropriate day to go. So there was a method to what you saw. I don't know whose memory you're honoring when you're running down the street with a Gucci bag. That's not about black people dying in America. That's about us killing ourselves when we do things like that. So this curfew is to say, please be at home by 9 o'clock tonight so that we can restore our city. And thank you to the men and women and children who went out today and began cleaning up our city. God bless you all. That's Atlanta.
I guess night that says it's going to work here?
Well, you've just answered it. It's a tool. It's just but one tool, the curfew is. But it's by no means an absolute. I mean, so I think I think it'll help us and simplify in some of the areas and how we execute, but it's just a tool. It's not a solve-all by any stretch of the imagination. So it's another layer that we're able to add on to help us with what we're trying to accomplish.
Chief, the individuals that were arrested yesterday, last night, were they mostly from the Atlanta area or from out of state?
I haven't, it's been such a whirlwind that we really just didn't get to compiling all the data till this morning, and I've not had a time to drill down through it. I've been in communication with the FBI and the GBI because we want to look very closely at those individuals we arrested. And I've not had, I glanced at some of it when it was coming in last night, and what I was seeing was out of state, but I haven't looked at enough of it to comment on it accurately. But we will certainly provide that once we're sure that we have it compiled properly.
Was there a moment last night where you realized that this was an escalation, was more than what was the moment for you when you realized this was more than just a protest at that time?
I sensed it when I was watching it, and I walked into the crowd because what I could sense was the officers were not accustomed to having the protesters breach them and challenge them in the manner they were. And so there was that feeling of how do we push them back, and it was too soon. It was getting escalated too quickly. And we needed to just stop and breathe and get a feel for the landscape. And so I think that was my first indication that the tenor was different. And then an hour into it, I don't know how long I was in there, when I saw a couple of the behaviors that were going on. And to the mayor's point, we are very fortunate a protester wasn't injured or killed, because what they did is on multiple occasions they started stampedes. And people just panicked and ran. And it was really, I was very grateful that we didn't have younger children. Sometimes at our protests we have kids, and I was glad we didn't there. But once I was in the middle of it and I was seeing some of the behaviors that were being exhibited, it became very clear that this was a different group of individuals we were dealing with. Thank you.
I'll just say this. There was also a very visible component to it. This is Atlanta. And Chief Shields made the point we met earlier. There's a racial component usually to protests in Atlanta. It's usually 90% African American, 10% white. This was 50-50 last night. It struck me when I looked at the screen. I noticed it immediately, and I know I'm not the only one who did. This is not to make assumptions about who lives in Atlanta. This is just in comparison to the protests that we have had in the past and what they look like, and on top of what they feel like.
Mayor Bonds, were you able, we heard you last night, you were incredibly emotional. Were you able to go out today and survey the damage? And just what went through your head when you were looking at your city?
You know, I actually, I had to watch it again. I didn't remember I didn't know what I said last night. And that was very much from my heart last night. You know, I've been in Atlanta my entire life, with the exception of a couple of years as a kid and going away to college. So Atlanta is always going to look and feel like Atlanta to me, even on its worst day. Because on the worst day in this city, I know there's a better day that's coming. And that's what it felt like to me. And when I saw the people out today cleaning up our city, and our crews were out there, that felt like Atlanta to me. And what I wanted more than anything was to us to get back to the conversation that we were having, that this was all about. This shouldn't have been about us talking about police cars burning and buildings being vandalized. This is about lives being lost. And and we've said it before, we don't have a perfect police department. Even with our last shooting in Atlanta, we immediately took our officers off of the federal task force because they wouldn't allow our officers to wear body cams so that we could have footage of what happened with our officers. This is a decision that Chief Shields and I talked about, and Chief Shields came back and said it's the right thing for us to do. That's what happens in Atlanta. And so what it felt like to me today was we are the city that cities across this country only wish that they could be. Which is why last night I said we're better than this as a city, and we're still better than this as a country.